Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your week. I apologize about yesterday. It has been a very long week for me, and I haven't really been sleeping much. But I will be back with that story I promised for Friday, on Monday. And tonight, we're reading 3 more scary cult encounters. But before we start, what are your cult experiences, if you've had any? Comment down below your experiences, and don't forget to like the video. Now with that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. The title explains it all. I'll explain everything to the best of my abilities. I'm not sure I'll make it. So, I'm posting this story as a cautionary tale to others to hopefully prevent future deaths. It was in the middle of the night. I was in a voice chat with 4 of my friends. Since I was going to be home alone for the next week, I could stay up and have fun without any issues. Around 4 a.m., we had run out of things to talk about, so there was an uncomfortable silence for the next few minutes. I was just looking around my room when suddenly, my phone turned on with a bright flash. I had gotten a notification telling me I had joined some random group I never even heard about. After some initial confusion, I opened the app and saw that the one who invited me was one of my friends in the voice chat with me. I asked him why he did that, and he just said he was bored and thought it would be fun for us to raid some random group chats. We thought about it and decided to try it out. We invited the other 2 friends and all checked out the group together. There were over 1,000 members, and right up until we joined, there was a conversation going on. They were talking about random stuff mostly. The best way I could describe it was like a Facebook group full of middle-aged moms talking about that boring stuff. There were a number of topics: the best detergent to remove carpet stains, auctions for phone cases and chargers, and a bunch of other usual stuff. There was nothing unusual going on, so we decided it was perfect timing to start. As teenagers, we began doing a number of weird stuff, from sending P-links to those dumb speed up your PC tutorials. After a while of doing random shit to annoy the members, there was still nothing. The friend that joined first said right as he joined he saw that people were still typing, but after that, it all stopped. We saw that our attempt at a raid had failed, as we weren't getting any angry messages or anything along those lines. As we were about to call it quits, the friend that was the first to join gasped in excitement. He has gotten a private message from the owner of the group. We all got really excited and told him to start sharing his screen so we could watch along. He got a message from the owner that boiled down to a welcoming to the group. The owner saw all our messages and asked what our intentions were. My friend then started role-playing as a grandmother in her late 80s. We all had a good laugh from it, when suddenly, within seconds of our last message, he sent the owner replied back with a screenshot. It was a screenshot taken from Google Maps. It was the front of his house. Although my friend was quiet as soon as he saw it, the rest of us started laughing our asses off. We reassured him it was Google Maps, so he wasn't there, obviously. Then, another message from the owner 10 seconds later. Parker Williams, 14 years old. Brian Sanders, 15 years old. William Aston, 14 years old. Adam Smith, 14 years old. He was reading all our private information back to us. At this point, nobody was laughing anymore. Even though we knew we got doxxed, we still thought he wasn't going to do anything else. For the next minute, it was pure silence. All 3 of my friends went to check if their doors were locked, while I kept looking through the group messages. After 5 minutes, there was finally another message from some random person in the group. It was another screenshot from Google Maps. This time, it was my house. Then, another one of William's house, then Brian's. I got another notification on my phone just then. The owner sent me a private message next. It was a 39-second video. The footage was really blurry and the camera was shaking. Most of the sound was heavy breathing until the last 9 seconds. The camera zoomed in and although blurry, I saw Parker. The owner was outside of his house currently. I yelled at Parker, but no response. Brian and William came back, but not Parker. The group chat started getting flooded with messages like, Parker has left. There were so many, I was convinced they were chatbots. I had gotten another picture from the owner. This one was really high quality, but the room was dark. The only light from the computer monitor, in the corner I saw something. It was on the ground with some sort of liquid next to it. Then, another picture closer to the thing on the ground. Then, another, and another. Eventually, I could tell it was Parker. This wasn't a joke anymore. The group chat started getting spammed with pictures of mutilated bodies and gore. Then, more pictures depicting satanic rituals. All of our face cams got turned on by themselves. In the background of Brian's room, I saw something moving. I asked him what it was, but he said he didn't see anything, and yelled at me not to make stupid jokes at a time like this. Before I could even say a word, I realized that behind him was a window. It was being opened by someone on the outside. I yelled at him to run, but by the time he realized what was going on, it was already too late. He got pulled away into the darkness. For the next 3 minutes, we still heard faint screaming. It was only me and William left. I had enough and went to call for help. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. After a few seconds, finally, someone picked up. 911, what's your emergency? Please, help, someone is breaking into my house. The sound of someone banging on my door startled me. It kept getting louder and louder. Then, the sound of shattering glass sent chills down my spine. I hid under my bed and tried to calm my breathing. Stay calm, sir. We need your address. I couldn't reply because I heard footsteps getting closer. Newcastle Street, Panama City, 8698. Please, help. Help is on the way, sir. Where are you right now? I'm hiding under my bed. I may not be able to respond if he gets too close. For a moment, there was pure silence. No sounds at all. Then a brief quiet sound of laughter. It got louder and louder. It was all coming from my phone. Soon enough, I could hear the same laugh coming from downstairs. I snuck my way to the closet. I hid inside there. As I'm writing this, I hear him getting closer. He went from room to room. He's almost here. My mother sat across from me, leaning forward onto the old oak desk in her office. That's what she called it, her office. Even though it was just that desk, a stack of old papers, and her chair in a room no bigger than a walk-in closet. I remember there was an insect flying around the overhead light, clanking into the bulb every so often. That would draw my attention away from my mother's words until she would snap her fingers to draw me back in. Eventually, she told me to listen up, or else the consequences would be huge. The insect was of no fascination to me anymore. My older brother and I were homeschooled. She was our teacher, and she took her job quite seriously. She was questioning me in regard to my brother's absence from class that morning. I said I didn't know where he was. That was the truth, for the most part. She insisted that because we share a room, I must have known something about his whereabouts. Again, I said I didn't know where he was. For perhaps the first time in my life, I noticed my mother's age. Her face sagged as if the weight of iron bars was bringing her skin down. Whether it was due to stress, or a lack of sleep, or any other reason in the world, she looked far older than I had ever noticed before. After a while of her sitting there, staring at me with those burdening eyes, both of her arms folded across the edge of the desk, I finally suggested that we go looking for him. And just where do you suppose we could find him? She asked. The woods, maybe? You know we aren't going into the woods. I don't think he would have made it that far anyway. Somebody surely could have stopped him in time. I don't know then. I don't know where he is. She stared at me for another infinite moment. Finally, the tension in her eyes broke. Well, then you'll just have to go to your room and don't come out. So, I did. I trotted back to my room. It was only a few steps away from her office, but tears had already begun to well in my eyes because I knew where my brother was. He did go into the woods, and I knew the exact path that he told me he was going to take. Like my brother, I wanted to leave. Unlike my brother, I was too afraid at that time to face the unknown. After all, I had never been in those woods, nor had I ever seen what sort of world existed beyond them, if any, for all I knew. I woke up that next morning to my mother banging on my bedroom door. Every morning, it seemed to be only one more beat away from falling off the hinges. I often wished it would, just so I wouldn't have to listen to that beating at 6:30 every morning. "Come on, come on, come on! Don't be late for class!" she yelled. She would repeat this constantly until I told her I was up and getting ready. My classroom was just the main room of the house. I sat on a chair and she sat beside me. A desk was in between us in case either of us needed to write something down. I remember that morning. I remember how my mother looked hollow. Perhaps she looked exactly what she was. A mother grieving her missing son, struggling to accept that there are far more important things in life, things for the future. I suspected that she had went and consulted my father that previous night. That's what she usually would do in a crisis. She always reassured her that good things will come. I said my pledge before sitting down. I was to always open the curtains and look at the middle house on the property as I said it. It went like this. To my father, I thank you. Through you, the seeds of my life were sown. I will give my all to you, until there is none left to give. I am of you, and of you I will always be. I am with you, and with you I will always be. I sat down beside my mother. She wasted no time telling me the story of a boy that ran from home decades ago. That boy, just a teenager at the time, was called upon by God to leave the horrors of society behind and to organize a group of good, faithful individuals. People that would act as God's replacement to society after its collapse. The man changed its name to Gabriel King before forming a community with 12 women. Each woman was to bear 2 of his own children. He warned the woman that their community is not immune, and that one day, a child will fall victim to Satan's temptations. That child will leave the community with the intention of bringing shame upon it. He also warned that following the first departure, another child would be granted, by God, the freedom of choice, either to stay and render his will, or leave and have the eternal horrors of Satan doing bestowed upon him. "This is the prophecy," my mother stated. "You, based on clear evidence according to your father, are the one granted that right to choose. Not to sway your opinion, but I must ask, do you choose morality, comfort, and our goodwill, or do you choose immorality and a diseased, evil livelihood?" She walked towards the door, careful not to let her black skirt drag the floor, and opened it. "If you choose to leave," she continued, "I will not stop you. It would be an interference with God's will." A cool breeze flowed into the room. I sat in silence for a moment, contemplating, twiddling a button on my shirt. "I'll stay," I muttered. I had no real intentions of staying, and I knew that. Truthfully, I was afraid of the possibility that she was right, that I was choosing the will of Satan and turning my back on all that is good. My mind was made up, but I couldn't bring myself to admit my true feelings. "Good," my mother said. She went directly into a new lesson. Days and days went by until finally, on a night of no other significance, I worked up the courage to follow my brother's footsteps, almost literally, and never seen the stale, dusty, foul-smelling shack that I had called home for all my years. There was nothing to my plan, just walk out the front door and leave. That simple. Only, it wasn't that simple, not in practice. Sure, I wouldn't have to worry about things the way my brother did. Everybody by this point had probably heard of the prophecy, and they would let me go. The issue is that my struggle was internal. Every day for years, I had given my allegiance to one man, to one lifestyle, and like everybody else around me, I held onto my faith without question. I believed in his sayings more than his doings, and I suppose that a part of me was not ready to let that go. I had been educated only by the standards of my own small world, the idea that something bigger may be out there, ready to prove me insignificant, was terrifying. Leaving home for the first time was a wager on reality itself. Leaving and staying were both dreadful. My mind was juggling spheres of different colors. I realized that I was pulling my own hair. That's it. That's enough thinking, I thought. It's time for me to go. I walked straight into the woods. I wondered how many other people in these small homes had considered doing what I was doing. I could barely do it myself, so I kept on walking. The woods are loud at night. Bugs and frogs and birds all chimed into some horrifying harmony. Wolves and coyotes made their noises heard on occasions as well. I couldn't begin to know what else was out there. Sometimes it sounded like something was behind me. I'd look, but of course nothing was there. I was sure that I was psyching myself out, but the sense of something behind me remained throughout the entirety of the night. I was sure that I heard somebody screaming for help. My brother. Oh, dear God. My brother is still in the woods, crying, screaming, pleading for help. I turned left towards the screams. They sounded further away, though. I turned right, and they were farther away again. I moved forward again, but the screams, his begging, never sounded any closer. I couldn't turn back. Oh, no, I could not turn back now. By that point, I had been walking forever, listening to his pleadings stab my ears, always sounding the same distance away, but no matter how much I walked, I threw up a prayer to whatever entity wanted to listen. I didn't care at that point to please let it all be in my head. I'd rather be going crazy than to have to listen to my poor innocent brother scream for help when there's nothing I can do. I kept on moving, not even willing to stop when the pain of the rocks and needles and twigs on the ground made my feet bleed and sting. At some point, the sky lightened up. Many of the noises, including the screaming, subsided. The birds sang much more lovely music. Finally, I came to the edge of the woods and everything was calm. The edge of the woods was nothing more than a long, narrow clearing before the trees began again. A trail of a fading black rock made a seam straight through it. Yellow and white lines ran the middle and edges of it. Now I know that was a road. At that time, I had never seen one. It never came up during schoolroom discussions. My legs were excruciatingly sore. My feet had moved past the point of pain and were now numb lumps of meat shelled in mud and blood. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or who to meet. In fact, I was afraid of seeing anybody. Soon enough, I felt the ground rumble just a tiny bit and heard a dull whistling. I turned my head and waited. When I saw it, I knew what it was. In school, my mother had explained that a vehicle is a machine that can transport people faster than God had ever intended humans to travel. If we were meant to move that fast, she'd say, God would have made our legs go that fast. Funny how she said all of that and didn't bother to mention the roads they drive on. It was a big vehicle with an open box attached to the back. I didn't expect vehicles to look like that. It slowed down and stopped on the grass beside the road. The driver hopped out and ran over to me. I considered running back into the woods. This man is going to snatch me and commit unspeakable sins against me. Surely, that's what he's going to do, I thought. I felt paralyzed and couldn't run away, even if I wanted to. The man stopped before me. He was mostly normal looking, a bit bigger than most people I had ever known. There was hair on his face, something I had never seen before. Jesus Christ, son, he said. I ain't even gotta worry about asking you no questions. Get in. I need to take you to the police. He finished off his sentence by taking off his hat, scratching his thinning head of hair, and carefully replacing it. I followed him back into his truck, half trusting him and half afraid of what might happen if I didn't. The first time I saw Police Chief Richards, he was leaned back in his office chair with his feet on his desk. When he saw me, he promptly dragged his feet and leaned forward. His eyes appeared to widen to the size of apples. He motioned for me to come forward and have a seat. The chief calmly did another visual scan over me, then looked back at the man who walked me into the office. Calmly, he looked at the man and said, Jesus, Leonard, I've seen some shit in my day, but nothing like this. What's the story? A guy found him on the side of the road. Brought him straight here, that's it. I think the kid says he doesn't have a name, but I can barely understand him. Well, boy. The chief looked back at me. Come take a seat. I'm Police Chief Richards, by the way. You don't have a name, I suppose. How old are you? Do you know where you're from? I'm 14. You're not going to hurt me, are you? I asked. Chief Richards kept his right ear toward me as I talked. He shifted his eyes to continue looking at me. He listened carefully and intently. You're asking if we'd hurt you? Now why on earth would we do that? No, we ain't here to hurt you. We want to help you because you look like you could use some of it. Now where are you from? He spoke softly and smiled again at the end of his sentences. The woods? I told him, in order to keep it short and understandable. I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him? Looking for your mother? Leonard, shut the door behind you and take some notes, would you? Son, I'd be happy to talk about your mother and see what we can do. I need some basic information first. Do you know where at in the woods you came from? No, brother, I said. I even drew a B and an R in the air, so he'd understand. Oh, your brother, Leonard. Hand this boy a sheet of paper and a pen. It'd be a lot easier if you could write the stuff down for us, okay? I wrote down all the information I could give him. I wrote that I was 14, looking for my brother, and am from a community in the woods, but I have no idea where at in the woods. Okay, how many people in that community? 35, now that my brother and I are gone, I wrote. Okay, son, we'll send some people out there to find this place. They must be the ones that did this to you, right? He pointed toward my arm and face. I sat in silence for a moment. I didn't know what to do or say. I took my sheet of paper and wrote the truth. It was an awkward moment of writing, but I did it. Father would make all his children dedicate themselves to him, one piece at a time. For me, it was my arm, an eye, an ear, and my lips. For my brother, it was more. Much, much more. He was close to being fully dedicated. Some tears smudged the ink as they fell into the paper. It hadn't occurred to me beforehand how much like a monster I must look to these people. A boy with a missing arm, an empty eye socket, just a plain hole for an ear, not even any lips, just exposed gums and rotting teeth. I felt disgusting. Chief was pale. And your brother? He asked. I suppose he must have crawled out of that place. I nodded, and the tears continued to fall. After a long moment of silence, the chief looked at me. You know, son, we're all born into some kind of cult or another. I'm glad you got out of yours. 10 years ago, I saw my daughter leave the village for the last time. Her hand firmly clasped her mother's as she was led away toward the Sweetwater River. There she would continue to be raised within a cult from then until her death, knowing no one other than the other slaves around her and, of course, the entity they called their prophet. My wife joined their cult before our daughter was born. She didn't give me an explanation, she just up and left one day. Before vanishing into thin air, she promised me that she would bring our child to the village with her to purchase silk for the Sweetwater weavers. We agreed not to make direct contact, but to simply trade in the same area for as long as we could, so I could see my girl as she grew. I had to learn to love from a distance. One day, I heard her ask my wife if they were going to bring a gift back to Sweetwater for her father. My blood boiled. Someone else had been helping my wife raise my daughter. I went over to approach my wife, but as I did so, I was stopped by an elder of the cult who had been watching us all from a distance. I was struck in the knees with a metal staff and left there helpless, while he informed my wife that they would have to leave the village immediately. As I watched the Sweetwater villagers walk out of our village, I began to notice a faint smell of petroleum wafting toward me. The gates closed behind the cult members and my daughter, locking them out forever. I was about to get off my knees and stumble home when I noticed the petroleum smell was getting stronger. I turned my head and saw my village being attacked by people wearing red material around their wrists. They were throwing us to the ground, tying our wrists together, then dumping buckets of petroleum on everyone. I dropped down and rolled into a ditch behind me, laying completely still so as to not be found. As I lay there, the smell of burning flesh flooded my nostrils. I heard the deafening screams of men, women, and children suffering in agony as they went up in flames. I was rather distraught. After a couple of hours, I heard the attackers heading back to their cult through the village gates, talking about how they would tell the others that we no longer wanted them here, and that if they showed their faces in town, that we would kill them. I'd thought I'd never see my daughter again, honestly. When I was sure that the cult members were far enough away from our town, I got out of the ditch and immediately began looking for survivors. There were none, unfortunately. Anyone that looked like they had survived was decapitated. I decided at that very moment I would plan to bring the Sweetwater cult to its knees, but I needed help. For 10 years, I sustained myself on canned food and water from the well, as I plotted my revenge against the prophet. I took books from the library on demonology, the occult, and the history of Sweetwater River. I left the empty village on my daughter's 21st birthday, promising myself that I could do this, and that I would tell her everything in due time. I spent 3 days on the river, eating nothing but fish and wild mushrooms that grew on the banks. Halfway along the journey, I lost an oar, so the last leg of the voyage was even more grueling than the first. As I approached the edge of the Sweetwater village, I noticed someone standing there, a girl in her early 20s. She was holding a small rose that she had just plucked not even a few minutes ago. I stared at her, and she stared back, before she carefully approached the boat. I stopped paddling for a second and placed down my oar. As she came closer to me, I recognized her face. She had the facial features of my wife, but ash blonde hair just like mine. It was my daughter. Because my wife left before she gave birth to her, I never got to hear her name. I couldn't possibly tell her I was her father without knowing anything about her. She'd never believe it. Instead, I climbed out of the boat and pulled her into a hug. Instead of asking who I was, however, she stumbled back a few feet, and then without looking back, she took off running. I felt like I scared her away. I felt as though I'd ruined my chances of being her father by scaring her shitless. I watched her run for a good few minutes before sitting back down in my boat. I had decided to rest and scan around the area. That's when I finally saw it. That thing they call the prophet was stood there watching something, just like a hawk watching its prey. I quickly tipped my boat sideways and filled it with water until it sank. Then I hid in the river with my head just poking out of the water. I didn't want it to see me. I didn't want it to get me. After I made sure it was gone, I reached beside me into the sunken canoe and grabbed my bag. Then I climbed up the bank and sprinted into the Sweetwater woods. For 3 days, I camped out there, scoping out the village and watching everyone's daily and nightly routines. The prophet did not sleep, and he has multiple people working for him around the hours of 12 a.m. to 5 a.m. Then, the villagers wake up and begin their everyday regime. On the last night, I saw someone walking from their hut out to the church. It wasn't one of the elders, nor was it a night shift worker. It was a villager, with ash blonde hair. She was carrying with her a sack, a cat, a lit candle, and a jar of something. I tried to get a closer look, but I couldn't see very well. All I could see was her scarlet dress blowing gracefully in the night wind. I watched as she approached the gates of the church. The church doors slid open ever so slowly without a sound, and the prophet stepped out of them. He led the girl round the back of the church into the graveyard where they keep the punishment pit, and I didn't see her for the rest of the evening. I did notice about 5 minutes after they vanished that familiar smell of burning flesh and petroleum. I thought it best to hide for the remainder of the night. I woke up the next day to screams coming from the hut that the girl had left from yesterday. I crawled along the edge of the woods toward her hut to get a better view of the commotion. As I did so, my wife stepped out of that, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. The prophet saw me, he saw my daughter, and quickly disposed of her. I couldn't believe it. I got up and ran to my spot where I'd hidden my belongings and gathered them together. That night, I snuck into my wife's hut. I climbed through my daughter's bedroom window and crept up to the door, opening it just enough to see into the living room. There, sat at the table with her head in her hands, was my wife. I didn't have my head screwed on properly at the time, so instead of waiting until she went to bed, I decided just to walk out there and confront her. I knew it was a terrible time to do such a thing, but I wasn't okay either. I needed answers from her. We talked all evening over a bottle of wine, and I explained to her all about how I was going to rescue them and take them home, even though there was nothing or nobody left to return to. That's when she slid some things across the table to me. It was my map, my ring, and 12 coins from my pocket. My daughter must have took them from me during our embrace. My wife then proceeded to pull out a note from her dress pocket. I read the entire thing aloud. It described some kind of nook in the forest she had seen, and how she planned to camp there long enough to convince the prophet she was dead. From there, she would run the entire length of the forest edge until she hit the crossing on the river to the village. I spent the night with my wife and her new husband, and the very next day, we decided to sneak into the woods to wait for our daughter, but she never came. Something was up. We were all thinking the worst, although we tried so hard not to. That night, we came up with a plan, and as best as we could, put the plan into place. My wife with her new husband went to distract the prophet with promises of competence and nighttime shifts, while I snuck into the punishment pit. The pit has a large metal covering on it, inscribed with paragraph upon paragraph of Latin writing, detailed the rites of the demon prophet. It took me a few minutes to slide it off the pit, but once I was able to, I slid down the ladder all the way to the bottom. There lay a burnt mahogany box, the remains of a cat, and something else that I couldn't identify immediately. It looked like a twisted corpse. Whosever body it was burnt to a crisp. I prayed to God that it wasn't my daughter's. I decided to move the body a little so I could see its face, but to my surprise, it didn't have one, only a slit for a mouth. That spanned across its head, ending where the ears should be. It wasn't her. I quickly climbed back up the ladder and out of the pit, frantically checking my surroundings. I saw my wife and her husband mixed in with the night workers, wearing a scarlet tie around both of their wrists. They were all in the process of erecting a new fence around the Sweetwater forest. The plan was working. I was at a loss as to where my daughter could be, and so I decided to sneak into the church to gather myself and come up with some new ideas. As I stepped through the doorway of the ominous building, a wave of terror hit me. Something really didn't feel right. I looked dead ahead of me, and my eyes fell upon the prophet. It was sat there on its giant wooden throne, a small ginger cat resting on its lap. This was my chance. I was alone with the entity. All the knowledge I had gathered over the last 10 years was for this very moment. I cautiously approached the entity, but to my surprise, it stayed in its place, and it didn't move a muscle. When I finally got close enough to strike, I pulled out a small dagger that I had made from the melted remnants of the crucifix that I had stolen from my village cathedral. I forged it above the fire that was fueled from the excess jars of petroleum the cult members left behind. I was about to strike when the prophet raised his hand and stood up, causing the cat flying off its lap and out of the church. The entity walked towards me slowly and whispered something in my ear. It fell through. I pushed him, it said. It wasn't a man's voice, but instead it was a woman's voice, a sweet angel-like voice. Before I could open my mouth to question it, the being pulled me into an embrace. "It will come back," she said, stepping away. "You must help us erect the fence." She pulled a piece of scarlet ribbon out of her pocket and told me not to raise any alarms, for the elders watching, and they will wake him again. I have been here a few months now, helping my daughter and my wife build a barrier. Most of them didn't know about this, but when they find, they will bring the real prophet back, and he will kill us all. Thanks for watching, Wolfpack. If you want to catch me by the fire next time, I upload every weekend including Friday. Don't forget to like the video as it helps me out more than you know. If you want to submit your story, head down to the description. Now, here's Roken to howl you off to sleep. Have beautiful nightmares.